My name's Alex, and growing up, I always felt like I was running a race I could never win. My younger sister, Emily, was the golden child. Bright, talented, and always in the spotlight. I was the older sibling, often overshadowed, doing my best to stay out of trouble and make my parents proud. But no matter how hard I tried, it never felt like enough. The favoritism was subtle at first, the kind you'd brush off as unintentional. I remember my 8th birthday vividly. Emily had just turned 5 a few months earlier, and my parents threw her the party of the century. There were balloons, a clown, a petting zoo, everything a little girl could dream of. When my birthday rolled around, all I got was a store-bought cake and dinner at home with the family. I didn't think much of it then, but looking back, it was the first of many moments where I realized my needs didn't hold the same weight as Emily's. Things didn't get any better as we grew older. When I turned 12, I saved every penny I earned from chores and small jobs to buy a bike I'd been eyeing for months. It was my pride and joy, until Emily decided she wanted one too. She cried to our parents about how unfair it was, and by the weekend, they bought her a newer, fancier model than mine. That day, I learned a bitter truth. In our family, Emily's tears carried more weight than my hard work ever could. By the time I was in high school, I threw myself into academics and extracurriculars, hoping it would make a difference. I joined the debate team, became the editor of the school newspaper, and maintained a perfect GPA. But no matter how many awards or accolades I brought home, my parents barely acknowledged them. Meanwhile, if Emily brought home a most improved ribbon from her middle school art class, they'd throw a celebratory dinner. I convinced myself for a long time that I could work harder, be better, and earn their approval. But deep down, I knew I was chasing something I might never get. The breaking point came during my junior year when I was selected for a prestigious summer program. It was an incredible opportunity, something I'd worked toward for years. But when I shared the news with my family, my dad grunted a half-hearted good job before asking about Emily's latest dance recital. My mom chimed in with a casual, "That's nice, dear," already scrolling through her phone to show pictures of Emily in her costume. That summer program turned out to be one of the best experiences of my life, but my parents' lack of support cast a shadow over it. They didn't even drive me to the airport, claiming Emily's recital was on the same day and they couldn't miss it. I ended up getting a ride from a friend's parents, feeling more like an afterthought than ever. By the time I graduated high school, I realized I had to stop seeking validation from them. It wasn't easy, but I focused on building a life for myself. I earned scholarships to college, graduated with honors, and landed a solid job. I even managed to buy my first home by the time I was 26. Despite my accomplishments, my parents' favoritism toward Emily didn't waver. If anything, it grew more pronounced. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I didn't need their approval anymore. But the cracks in our family dynamic ran deeper than I realized, and they were about to widen in ways I couldn't imagine. After college, I stayed in touch with my parents, but our relationship remained distant. I called every week and visited during the holidays, but it always felt like I was walking into Emily's world. Her achievements, her struggles, and her dreams were the centerpiece of every conversation. I didn't resent her for it. Emily was kind, and she never asked for the pedestal they put her on. But it was exhausting being the afterthought in my own family. Things took a turn when my grandparents passed away. They were wonderful people, the kind who treated everyone fairly and had a way of making you feel special, even in a crowd. I was especially close to them growing up. My grandmother would always say, "Alex, you work so hard, you'll go far." It was the kind of encouragement I rarely got at home. When they passed, it was a devastating loss for the entire family. My parents handled most of the arrangements, and I did what I could to support them. Emily, as usual, became the center of attention. My mom kept saying, "This is so hard on her, she's so sensitive," as if the rest of us weren't grieving too. A few months later, the topic of my grandparents' estate came up. They'd left a will, and my parents had been named the executors. I hadn't given it much thought. I figured it would be divided equally among the family, which seemed fair. My grandparents had always emphasized the importance of fairness, so I trusted their wishes would reflect that. When my parents finally called a family meeting to discuss the inheritance, I walked in with no expectations. My main concern was ensuring their memory was honored and that we could handle things without drama. But as the meeting unfolded, it became clear that fairness wasn't on the table. The will stated that my grandparents' assets, including their home, savings, and a small collection of valuable heirlooms, would be divided between their children and grandchildren. It sounded straightforward, but when my dad started breaking down the allocations, I felt my stomach tighten. "The house will go to Emily," he announced, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I blinked, confused. Wait, the house? All of it? Yes, my mom said, her tone firm. She needs a place to live, and this will set her up for success. Emily had just graduated college and was working a part-time job while trying to establish herself as an artist. I was happy for her, but I couldn't ignore the glaring disparity. "What about me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My dad glanced at me like I'd asked a stupid question. "You already have your own house, Alex. You're doing fine." My blood boiled, but I tried to stay calm. This isn't about who's doing fine. Grandma and Grandpa wanted things to be fair. How is giving Emily the entire house fair? "She's younger," my mom said, as if that explained everything. "She needs more help right now." I looked at Emily, hoping she'd say something, but she just stared at the table, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't ask for this," she mumbled, but my parents waved her off. "Emily deserves it," my mom said, her voice rising. "She's worked hard and she's been through a lot, and I haven't?" The words came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't stop myself. I've worked my ass off to get where I am, with no help from anyone. This isn't about who deserves it more. It's about what's fair. My dad's face hardened. "Life isn't always fair, Alex. You're doing well for yourself. You should be grateful for what you have. Grateful." That word hit me like a slap in the face. I'd been busting my ass for years, earning everything I had without relying on anyone. And now I was being told to be grateful for being left out? The conversation spiraled from there. My parents accused me of being selfish, of trying to take from my sister when she needed it more. I tried to explain that it wasn't about taking. It was about honoring our grandparents' wishes, but they wouldn't listen. By the end of the meeting, I felt like a stranger in my own family. Emily got the house, and I was given a small sum of money that paled in comparison to what she'd received. "This is what's best for everyone," my mom said, as if she was doing me a favor. That night, I drove home in silence, replaying the meeting over and over in my head. I didn't know what hurt more, the blatant favoritism or the realization that my parents would never see me as an equal to Emily. For years, I'd told myself I didn't need their approval, but deep down, I'd always hoped they'd come around. Now, I wasn't so sure. The days after that family meeting were some of the hardest I'd experienced in years. I tried to focus on my work, on my friends, on anything that would keep my mind off what had happened. But every time I thought about it, my parents' dismissal of my feelings, the blatant favoritism, Emily's silence, I felt that familiar ache in my chest. The kind I'd learned to live with over the years but had never fully understood. Emily called me a few days later. Her voice was soft, hesitant, like she already knew what I was going to say. "Alex, I'm sorry," she began. "I didn't want the house. I didn't even know they were planning to give it to me." "Then why didn't you say anything?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. "You just sat there while they handed you everything." "I didn't know what to say," she admitted. "It's not like I asked for this. What was I supposed to do, turn it down?" "Yes," I said bluntly. "If you knew it wasn't fair, you could have spoken up. But instead, you just let it happen." There was a long pause. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said quietly. I thought you'd be okay with it." That stung more than I expected. The assumption that I'd be okay with being sidelined yet again, that my feelings didn't matter, was almost worse than the actual decision. "You don't get it, Emily," I said, my voice firmer now. "This isn't just about the house. This is about years of being treated like I don't matter. This was their chance to make things right, and they didn't." She didn't respond right away, and when she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Alex. I really am." I hung up shortly after, too drained to continue the conversation. Emily's apology felt genuine, but it didn't change anything. She still had the house. My parents still saw her as the one who needed it more, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a relationship that had been crumbling for years. The next time my mom called, I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail, and when I finally listened to the message, her words made my stomach turn. "Alex, I don't understand why you're being so difficult about this. We made the best decision for the family, and you need to respect that. You've always been so independent. You don't need our help. Emily does. Be the bigger person." The phrase echoed in my head long after the message ended. For years, I'd been the bigger person. I'd stayed quiet when they overlooked me. I'd worked twice as hard to prove myself, even when I knew it wouldn't make a difference. But now, I was done being the bigger person. I deserved better than that. I didn't call her back. Instead, I started to reevaluate what family meant to me. Growing up, I'd always thought of family as the people who were supposed to have your back no matter what. But now I realized that wasn't always the case. Sometimes family lets you down. Sometimes they hurt you. And sometimes you had to step back to protect yourself. I began to focus on the relationships that actually brought value to my life. Friends who celebrated my successes, colleagues who respected my hard work, and mentors who saw my potential. I reached out to my grandparents' old friends, people who'd known them better than anyone, and spent hours listening to their stories. It felt like a way to honor their memory, even if my parents had failed to do so. Through those conversations, I started to find closure. My grandparents had always believed in me, even when my parents didn't. They saw my hard work, my determination, and my potential. And that meant more to me than any inheritance ever could. But even with that clarity, cutting ties with my parents wasn't easy. They called and texted regularly, alternating between guilt-tripping me and acting like nothing had happened. My dad even showed up at my house once, unannounced, to try to talk some sense into me. "You're being ridiculous," he said, standing in my doorway with his arms crossed. "This isn't about favoritism. It's about fairness. Emily needs the house more than you do. You're just being selfish. Selfish ? Repeated, my voice calm but firm. You're the ones who ignored my feelings, who dismissed everything I've worked for. This isn't about the house, Dad. It's about respect. And you've made it clear I don't have any in this family." He scoffed, shaking his head. "You've always been too sensitive." I didn't respond. There was no point in arguing with someone who refused to see my side. Instead, I told him to leave, shutting the door behind him as he muttered under his breath. That night, I sat on my couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd done the right thing. Cutting ties with my parents felt like cutting off a piece of myself, but it also felt necessary. For the first time in years, I was putting myself first, and it was both terrifying and liberating. Over the next few weeks, I focused on rebuilding, not just my relationship with myself, but also the life I wanted to create. I poured myself into my work, took up hobbies I'd let fall by the wayside, and spent more time with the people who truly cared about me. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like I was reclaiming my identity, separate from the expectations and judgments of my family. The weeks after cutting ties with my parents were strangely quiet. I'd spent so much of my life trying to meet their expectations, navigating their favoritism, and walking on eggshells around their judgments that I didn't know what to do with the space I'd created. At first, it felt like a void, but slowly that void began to feel like freedom. I threw myself into work with a focus I hadn't felt in years. My projects took on new life, and I started saying yes to opportunities I might have hesitated on before. A colleague invited me to collaborate on a big proposal for our company, and instead of second-guessing myself, I jumped in with both feet. It felt good, empowering even, to realize that I didn't need my parents' approval to validate my accomplishments. Outside of work, I started reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with. Marcus, my best friend since college, was the first person I called. "Man, it's about time you stop letting them hold you back," he said when I told him everything. "You've been carrying that weight for too long." He was right. For years, I'd let their opinions shape how I saw myself, even when I knew they weren't fair. Now, for the first time, I was learning how to see myself through my own eyes. Emily reached out occasionally, her messages always hesitant and apologetic. She didn't bring up the house or our parents, which I appreciated. Instead, she'd ask how I was doing, share revise about her art, or reminisce about childhood memories. I wanted to be angry with her, to hold her accountable for staying silent during that family meeting. But I couldn't. Emily wasn't the one who had built this dynamic. She'd just been caught in it, like me. One evening, she called me out of the blue. "I miss you," she said quietly. "I hate how things turned out." "Me too," I admitted, but I needed to step away. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. "I understand," she said. "For what it's worth, I think you're right. About everything." Her words were a balm I didn't realize I needed. It didn't fix the past, but it felt like a small step toward healing. We agreed to keep in touch, and while our relationship was far from perfect, it was something. Meanwhile, I began focusing on myself in ways I hadn't before. I took up running, something I'd always talked about but never committed to. At first, it was just an excuse to get outside and clear my head, but as the miles added up, I found that running became a form of therapy, a way to process my thoughts and channel my frustrations into something productive. I also started volunteering at a local community center, teaching workshops on professional development and career building. It was something my grandparents had always encouraged me to do, give back to the community that shaped me. Standing in front of those small groups, sharing what I'd learned about hard work and resilience, felt like a way to honor their memory. One evening, after a particularly long run, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea and thought about everything that had happened. My parents' betrayal still hurt, but it no longer consumed me. The anger had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve. I wasn't going to let their choices define me or my future. I started setting goals for myself, not to prove anything to anyone, but because I wanted to. I saved up for a trip abroad, something I'd dreamed about for years but had always put off. I signed up for a photography class, dusting off the old camera my grandparents had given me when I was a teenager. And for the first time in a long time, I felt excited about what was ahead. One day, while organizing some old boxes, I came across a stack of letters my grandmother had written to me over the years. Most of them were from when I was in college, filled with her usual mix of encouragement and practical advice. But one letter, written shortly before she passed, stood out. "Alex," it read, "life isn't always fair, but you have the strength to rise above it. Don't let anyone dim your light or make you feel less than you are. You're capable of great things. Don't ever forget that." I sat there for a long time, holding the letter in my hands. Her words were a reminder of everything I'd been fighting for: my independence, my self-worth, my future. I wasn't just moving forward, I was moving on. Months turned into a year, and the life I had before felt like a distant memory. The anger and frustration that had once consumed me had faded into something softer, something I could carry without it weighing me down. I was no longer defined by my parents' favoritism or the choices they'd made. Instead, I was focused on the life I was building, a life that felt entirely my own. Work had become more than just a job, it was a source of pride. The projects I'd thrown myself into had paid off, and I'd recently been promoted. My team respected me, my ideas were valued, and I felt like I was finally stepping into my potential. It was a far cry from the days when I'd sought validation from my parents and come up empty-handed. Outside of work, I'd found new ways to reconnect with myself. Running had become a daily ritual, and I'd signed up for my first 10K race. The photography class I'd taken reignited a passion I hadn't felt in years, and I spent weekends exploring nearby parks and cityscapes, capturing moments that felt uniquely mine. It was as though I was rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under years of trying to fit into someone else's expectations. Emily and I had kept in touch, though our relationship was still fragile. She texted often, sharing revise about her art and asking how I was doing. I appreciated the effort, even if there were times when it felt like she was tiptoeing around the past. One afternoon, she invited me to visit her at the house, my grandparents' house. "I think it would mean a lot to them if you came," she said. "It still feels like their place, you know?" At first, I wasn't sure how to respond. The thought of walking back into that house with all its memories and all the pain tied to the inheritance was daunting. But after some thought, I agreed. It wasn't about the house itself, it was about finding closure. When I arrived, Emily greeted me at the door, looking nervous but hopeful. The house felt both familiar and different. She'd kept many of my grandparents' belongings, the old clock in the hallway, the quilt my grandmother had sewn, but she'd also made it her own. For the first time, I didn't feel resentment walking through those rooms. Instead, I felt a quiet sense of peace. We sat in the living room and talked for hours. Emily apologized again, this time with more sincerity than before. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she admitted. "You were right, it wasn't fair. And I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you when I should have." Her words didn't erase the past, but they mattered. "Thanks, Emily," I said. "I'm not angry anymore. I just want us to move forward." By the time I left, I felt lighter. The house no longer felt like a symbol of loss. It felt like a bridge between who I was and who I was becoming. And while my relationship with Emily still needed work, I knew we were on the right track. As for my parents, things were still complicated. My mom called occasionally, her tone softer than it used to be. She didn't apologize outright, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in her voice, as if she finally understood why I'd stepped away. I didn't press her for more. I'd learned that some wounds heal slowly, if at all, and that was okay. I wasn't waiting for an apology to move on. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about everything that had brought me to this point. The years of feeling unseen, the bitter fight over the inheritance, the decision to put myself first. It had all led me here. And while the journey hadn't been easy, I was proud of how far I'd come. I raised a glass of wine to the sky, as if toasting my grandparents. "Thank you," I whispered, feeling their presence in the quiet evening air. They'd always believed in me, even when others didn't. And now, I was finally starting to believe in myself. The future felt wide open, like a canvas waiting for me to paint my own story. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. Story 2. When I was 17, something happened that threw me back into memories I had long buried. My biological mother, Mia, reached out to me after a decade of silence. I hadn't seen or spoken to her since I was 7 years old, the day she handed me over for adoption. My adoptive parents, whom I'll call Mom and Dad here, became my everything. They took me in right after my father passed away. But Mia's reappearance churned up feelings I thought I'd outgrown. Mia had me when she was just 20 in college, with my biological father, Aaron. They married young, driven more by circumstance than love. Dad was diagnosed with leukemia when I was 3, and though I remember bits and pieces of him from my early years, the memories are hazy. By the time I was 7, he was gone, and my life changed in ways I could never have predicted. The day after my dad's funeral, Mia handed me over to my new family. I wasn't even allowed to say goodbye to Dad properly or stay in our home for a few days to process it all. It turned out the adoption was already arranged before Dad's death. Mia had been planning it for months. She told me that my new family would take care of me for a little while, but those days turned into weeks, months, and eventually years. I remember crying, waiting for her to call or visit, but she never did. My biological grandparents kept in touch occasionally. At first, they avoided my questions about why Mia left me. By the time I was 14, I learned the truth. Mia had started an affair with my uncle Ethan, while my dad was battling cancer. As Aaron grew weaker, Ethan's health also declined, and Mia made it clear that she wanted to start a life with Ethan once Dad was out of the picture. Neither Mia nor Ethan wanted to raise me, so they decided I should be adopted. Mia told her parents about the affair and her plans, but they were horrified. Still, they chose to stay quiet about it, not wanting to add to Aaron's suffering. Mia also said she never wanted to be a mother, that she was pressured into having me and marrying Dad. She was eager to leave behind both her responsibilities and the stigma of single parenthood. Her solution was to arrange for me to be adopted by my current parents, who couldn't have more children of their own. I'll admit, I got lucky. My adoptive parents are incredible. They gave me a stable, loving home, and I gained an older brother and a big extended family. For years, I didn't think much about Mia or Ethan. My new life was so much better than what I could have had if they'd raised me. But Mia's sudden message threw me off balance. She found me on social media and asked if we could reconnect. I was cautious, but curious. I wanted closure more than anything else, so after some back and forth, I agreed to meet her. When I decided to meet Mia, I didn't tell my adoptive parents or grandparents. I knew they'd be upset, and honestly, I wanted to handle it on my own. I arranged to meet her at a small cafe, telling myself I just wanted to hear her out and see what she had to say after all these years. Mia greeted me with a warm smile and looked genuinely happy to see me. At first, the conversation was polite, even pleasant. She told me she regretted giving me up and explained that she'd been too young and overwhelmed to be a mother. She claimed her parents had pressured her to marry Aaron and have me, but she wasn't ready for any of it. She painted a picture of a girl pushed into a corner, unable to see a way out. As she talked, I could sense something was off. The sincerity in her words didn't match the desperation in her eyes. She soon admitted she wasn't just there to reconnect with me, she needed my help. Her marriage to Ethan was falling apart, and she believed that reconciling with her parents and Aaron's parents would help her fix things. Apparently, Ethan had started pushing for reconciliation, blaming her for how badly things had spiraled. Mia thought I could convince them to forgive her and, in turn, help save her marriage. I felt a cold wave of anger and disappointment wash over me. This wasn't about making amends with me. It was about her problems. She wanted me to be a pawn in her attempts to repair the damage she and Ethan had caused. When I confronted her about it, she teared up, insisting she only wanted to make things right. I stood my ground and told her I wasn't interested in helping her with her problems. I reminded her that she had abandoned me when I needed her most, and that my life was better without her. Her expression hardened, and her tone shifted. She accused me of being brainwashed by my adoptive family, and claimed that I didn't understand what she'd been through. She said I was selfish for not empathizing with her struggles. I couldn't listen to her anymore. I told her that while I appreciated the effort to meet, it was clear we had nothing left to say to each other. As I walked out of the cafe, she called after me, but I didn't look back. Later that evening, Mia sent me a long voice message. She was crying, calling me her daughter, and begging me to reconsider. She said she didn't regret having me, even if she hadn't been ready to be a mother. Her words left me conflicted, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that this was just another manipulation. She had never truly been my mother. She'd made that choice long ago. I decided to tell my family about the meeting. They were understandably upset, especially my grandparents. They warned me about Mia's history of manipulation, and I knew they were right. Still, I explained that I'd needed to see her for myself, if only to find closure. My adoptive parents were more forgiving, relieved that I had no intention of speaking to Mia again. Unfortunately, Mia didn't take the hint. A few days later, she tried contacting me again, this time showing up near my school. She pulled up in her car and begged me to get in, saying she just wanted to talk. I refused, warning her that I'd cause a scene if she didn't leave me alone. That's when her desperation turned to anger. She started yelling, accusing me of being ungrateful and heartless. She even made vague threats telling me to watch my back. I walked away and went straight home, where I told my parents everything. That night, we decided to file for a restraining order. It wasn't just about protecting me. It was about setting a boundary she couldn't cross again. In the days that followed, more information came to light. My grandparents learned that Mia and Ethan had been struggling financially. Their business was failing, and it became clear that their attempts to reconnect with the family were motivated by money. Ethan had even tried to reach out to his parents separately, claiming Mia's actions were to blame for the family fallout. But no one was buying it. I blocked Mia on every platform. She made a few last-ditch attempts to contact me, even creating fake accounts, but I didn't respond. The restraining order was granted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt some relief. Looking back, I don't regret meeting Mia. It gave me the closure I needed, even if it wasn't what I expected. I now know for certain that I don't need her in my life. I have a family who loves and supports me, and that's more than enough. Whatever happens with Mia and Ethan, it's no longer my concern. I'm moving on, focusing on my future, and leaving the past behind where it belongs.